Hello everyone, I'm James Harkins, host of This Week in Texas History, a weekly show that is part of the Save Texas History program. Save Texas History is brought to you by Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office. If you love our state's history and want to make sure that it lasts forever, please visit savetexashistory.org and consider making a tax-deductible donation.
Today I'd like to welcome Dr. Mylynka Kilgore Cardona. She is an assistant professor of history at Texas A&M University-Commerce, and she is a transatlantic historian with a background in historical cartography. Dr. Cardona worked for the Texas General Land Office while she curated exhibits on state and county maps. Mylynka has taught courses in U.S. history, cartography, historical geography, world travel, travel writing, and gender studies. Dr. Cardona also serves as the coordinator for the Public History Graduate Certificate. She is currently writing a manuscript about 19th century Dutch woman, Alexine Tinne, who she will need to correct me on pronouncing, who traveled and explored the Nile River in the 1850s and 1860s. Dr. Cardona, thank you for being here to have a Save Texas History conversation. First, can you update us on where you're teaching, what you're doing, and what specifically you are teaching with regards to Texas history?
Absolutely. Thank you for that lovely intro, and thank you so much for having me to come on and talk. As you know, I'm a big fan of Texas history and saving Texas history. So I do teach Texas history. I teach it as a survey class. So our students get it in one semester. So I basically have to do Native Americans until as close to the quote unquote present as I can get. And so they get, as you would expect from me, they get a lot of early, and I mean early Texas history. A lot of our students, of course, come in with this preconceived notion that Texas history begins in 1836 or maybe 1834. So it's kind of nice to show them that Texas has this really long history, and then they are forced to learn Texas cartography on top of all that. So it's really cool. I kind of co-opted stuff that we did when I was at the GLO. So I actually open with kind of how Texas got its shape when we talk about Texas, and I take them back through time until we just get a nice image of the continent, and that's where we start when we talk about the history of Texas.
Whenever I was in history class in high school, we got to World War II, and then we had about 2 weeks left, and so we took about 1 day per decade. So imagine trying to fit the 1960s into a single hour-long class, not the easiest thing to do.
I hear from friends who teach at the high school level, you know, that they do like World War II in a day, and then they have to kind of keep moving.
Yeah. You used to be the map curator here at the GLO, and one of the exhibits that you worked on was called Mapping Texas. And we essentially mapped how Texas got its shape, which is something that you just talked about. Can you talk a little bit about your work on that exhibit, as well as before you were at the GLO, you were earning your PhD at UT Arlington, which has one of the great map collections, not only in the state, but in the country, if not the world, and how that prepared you for your career in teaching and working with maps, and now teaching with maps.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of love to tell this a little bit, because when I was getting ready to start the doctoral program at UT Arlington, there was a required full year of cartography. And I'm honest, and I may have told you this before, that I thought, oh God, maps, come on, I'm not interested in that at all. You know what, I'm gonna take these 2 classes, I'm out. And I got into the cartography classes, and they're taught by Dr. Emra Demhart, and who then became my advisor, because like what happens with a lot of folks with maps is you see them, we use them, you know, the map we use all the time is on this thing, right? But we don't think a lot about maps as being these great historical documents. And so I got in this class and started learning about historical cartography and learning about maps and their place in history. And not only that, how maps tell us something very specific about the time in which they were created, right? And so as I took these classes that I swore I was going to hate, I never wanted to have to do again, I really fell in love with cartography. And I really fell in love with kind of what maps can tell us about history, and maps is a really integral part of primary text documents of history. So fell in love with these classes, ended up becoming a research assistant for Dr. Demhart, which then got me involved with Texas Map Society, got me involved with Society for History Discoveries, these sort of professional organizations that really kind of led me into this path of maps and how they're created, and then how we use them for research and as an educational tool, right, as a teaching tool. But all of my work with maps, of course, then led me to a career in public history. That led me then to when there was an opening at the GLO, and then I applied there to get to work with maps and to kind of be able to do some deep dives into this wonderful collection that is housed at the GLO, and being able to kind of research them and then use them to kind of curate these wonderful stories that you can tell just using maps and the history behind these maps. So it ties into when I first arrived at the GLO was with the exhibit at the Whitty, was Mapping Texas at the Whitty was about to happen. And I kind of came in right, just not too long before that exhibit went live. And what I loved about that particular exhibit, which I know then we took on to Houston Museum of Natural History in Houston, was that we can really like trace how Texas became Texas, but then to be able to take people through this exhibit, be able to take them and show them literally not only the physical borders of Texas, but all of the different political changes through the different nations that have been in charge of Texas, to all the way to statehood, to see how these borders changed, what happened historically in order for Texas to get that iconic shape that it has. And I think that's one of the brilliant things about that exhibit that I know had been in the works for several years before I came to the GLO, was that it's this beautiful kind of rendering of how Texas gets that shape. And also letting people see maps not only as, just these old things, but also what beautiful pieces of art they are as well. And of course, everyone knows like monsters and things on maps, and then we get into that nice scientific space where they get kind of boring. And then they've kind of made this resurgence into beautiful pieces of art.
One of the things that you talked about was whenever you first started at the GLO, how we were trying to tell all these stories between all of these maps and incorporating our documents. And one of the things that through our Save Texas History program is we like to say that we've got 45,000 maps and another 36 million documents. And each one of those documents represents a different story. And then whenever you get into the map collection, each one of those maps represents hundreds of stories. Can you talk a little bit about how in public history you try to relate some very complex stories and how that reflects in the work that you're doing as a professor at Commerce?
Yeah, as you know, from doing these exhibits, you've got to get all of this research and all of these, books and documents and primary sources, secondary sources, all of these things about a person, an image, a map, down to about 150 words or less for the piece that goes next to the map or the land grant, whatever it is that's on display. And so it kind of becomes this fine art of distillation, right? How do I figure out how to say what I need to say to convey what this is about in a very limited amount of space? So I think part of it is knowing the history, right? Knowing the research and or doing the research behind it so that you know enough that you can pull out the essence of it. So it's figuring out what is it I want to say about this exhibit or about this particular item in an exhibit. How do I take this, 5 books that I've read about this topic and get it into 75 words that's going to be meaningful to someone who sees this and can make a connection to that document or that event. And I think that is one of the things that you have to be good at as a public historian. One of my favorite things when, we had people in the map vault or coming on tours at the GLO is when someone would say, oh, can I see such and such county? Because my great whoever came in and they lived there. And, and when we can pull documents and say, hey, we found this and we think this is so-and-so, your great whoever's signature, and just watch them get super excited about it. So it's making that, I think it's making people have that connection to history because so many people are so disconnected from history, right? And one of the challenges that I face, and I think a lot of people who teach history, students come in and I always ask them, how many of you hate history? go ahead, don't, raise your hand if you hate it. I mean, I've got students that practically dislocate a shoulder trying to throw that arm straight up, I'm like, why do you hate it? Oh, it's boring, it's old. And, they don't have any connection to it. So I think public history is really important because it's history outside of the classroom, So when you can get that in an exhibit, digital exhibit, right, and make that connection, then they say, oh, I get it. Oh, what else can I look up online about this? Where can I go see more of this? And I think that's what's really important for public history, especially right now when we're all like we're doing this interview now, right? We're all in our separate spaces online, is how do we make those connections? This is a really critical time, I think, for archives, education, museums, these kind of things, because it's how do we then make those connections digitally?
Whenever I was introducing you, I mentioned that you not only have spent a lot of time studying history and American and U.S. history, but also European transatlantic history, but also gender history.
Yes.
And so your dissertation, I think, does a really good job of pulling that all together and telling the story of a really fascinating woman. I want you to introduce who that woman is. Give us a little bit more.
The doctoral program I came out of at the time at UT Arlington was transatlantic history. So we had, our dissertations all had to have a transatlantic bent to them, right? I was that PhD student who couldn't figure out what I wanted to write about and was terrified. I could not go to my professor and say, I don't know what I want to do, because I'm a doctoral student and, I should know what I'm doing. So eventually I, swallowed my pride and went and talked to Demhart and said, listen, I have no idea what to write about. And he said, tell me about what you're interested in. All the things you listed, right? Travel, women, gender studies, like these sort of things. And a translator. And he said, hey, have you ever heard about Alexandrine Tine? And I said, no. He said, go look her up. And I did, like every good student, got straight on the Google and did a Google search. And what came up? This little tiny Wikipedia page. Well, wrote about her for that class. Then I presented at my first kind of professional conference for Society of History Discovery in 2009. And now here we are, 2020, and I'm writing a book about her. So she's a Dutch woman who traveled and explored on the Nile River in the 1850s and 60s, which might throw up a little bit of a flag because women generally weren't explorers in the mid-19th century. So 1850s, 1860s, we're looking at the time kind of when Europe is making its big push into discovering the interior of Africa, right? So they're trying to find out what's the source of the Nile. That's the big push. So all these big name explorers are out there. Livingston, Grant, Speke, Baker, right? All these folks. And then there's Alexandrine Tine. So these guys get really wound up. These guys, I should say, did get really wound up about her, except Livingston, he liked her. Because they're these, very typical British manly explorers out with their, guns shooting hippos and things. And then here she is, this fabulously wealthy young woman. She's under 30 at the time. She's traveling, she's exploring. She does the kind of the grand tour that a lot of wealthy people did at the time. Travels down the Nile, sees the sights, that sort of thing. Comes back to The Hague and says, I want to go back, but I want to do this as an exploration. And so she gets involved with the search for the source of the Nile. And she ends up, for several years, doing different expeditions on the Nile. And what makes it very controversial at the time is she's a lady traveling. 2, she's unescorted. They go with no male relatives. She's not married, no brothers, fathers, uncles, or anyone go with them. And I say them because she travels with her 50-something-year-old mother and her mother's 50-something-year-old sister. So now we have 3 unescorted women, scandalous, traveling up and down the Nile in the 1860s. And they're sending back scientific information and ethnographic information back to the Royal Geographical Society in London. So there's all of this kind of happening where she is in deep with kind of the scientific community and what's happening. However, they don't want to acknowledge her because she's a woman. So this is where my work really kind of looks at this interplay between kind of class, because she has the money to go do it. She doesn't have to ask for money to do this like the male explorers do. She can just go. Nationality and colonialism, because the Royal Geographical Society says, hey, we got this lady who's just sending us all this info back for free. So we're going to keep taking it. Oh, maybe we should make her a member, a couple of the guys say. rest of the guys are like, no, this is a man's organization. But please let her, please keep reading out her missives that she sends back. So she sends back all this kind of very important information about places on the Nile that other explorers had not been. So my work looks at this, kind of looks at how she's exploring, where she's going, what she's doing, but also the reception to her and kind of the pushback. But yeah, so I kind of take this kind of history, gender, colonialism, exploration, discovery. That's what I'm doing this fall, is trying to get all of that work into a publishable manuscript.
The Land Office doesn't really have a vast chasm of maps that deal with the Nile River or Africa, or really not even a whole lot of transatlantic history. So we try to figure out together, well, what's a topic that ties into the Land Office, into our collection, that also connects to history that you're already working on, and history that you might be interested in kind of running with. And one of the topics that came up was a woman named Althea Armstrong, who was a cartographer in the mid-20th century. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you're doing on Althea and where that's taking you?
So Althea is really cool because she worked for the GLO at a time, all through the 1940s, 50s, 60s. I think she retires kind of mid-70s from the Land Office. And in her time there, not only did she draft incredibly accurate, like the official maps of different Texas counties, but she's really unique because she's an amazing artist. Maps that had these beautiful calligraphy title pages and other items that she would kind of decorate the map with. She started incorporating 19th century history from the different counties into her maps. So, and you have the neat line, which is kind of the border that goes around the maps. There would be these vignettes of Texas history, particular to a county, or like in the, there's a 3-map series for, I believe it's Brewster County, that she has animals, right? So there's like a mountain lion, there's like a hunter with a stag over the back of his horse, and there's duck. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that she does. So she kind of imbued her maps of Texas with Texas history, Texas plants and animals, things like that. We know that she did scrolls, like she did these beautiful decorative scrolls that were given out as awards and kind of stuff. And then kind of in the research that I've done recently, scrolls that were given to heads of state, royalty that visited. But I would really love to kind of find out where a lot of these things ended up. So that was a really exciting kind of discovery for me, is that not only is it like GLO related, but state of Texas, like she's doing this kind of stuff. So it kind of ties her in not only to not just the maps and the 19th century history she's putting on the maps, but puts her kind of in touch with other dignitaries and things that are happening in Texas in the 20th century. And the fact that she's kind of been, or at least her artwork was called upon for very important things that were happening in the state of Texas in the early 20th century.
One of the interesting things about Althea's work was that those earlier period maps would include ornate artistic elements that would really kind of supplement and back up the political point that they were making. What is something that surprised you about Althea Armstrong in the research that you're doing, and where it's leading you next?
So I think what surprised me, right, is to see that in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, that these are the official county maps for Texas, that they are these beautifully hand-drawn, hand-lettered, they're true manuscript maps, right? They're all done by hand. They're not printed. But like I tell my cartography students, we always want to look at why maps were made, because the maps tell us a lot about the time in which they were created. I think as a historian, a lot of times we look at stuff that goes onto maps. I know when we did the exhibit at the Bullock of some of her maps, there was some concern from folks higher up there of some of the violence that was depicted on the county maps, as well as some of the language from the time. And, I really went to the bat and said, this was the time. This is what's being represented. This is how things were thought of at the time. And Althea didn't hold back. Some of her images are pretty graphic. And I think that's important, right? That's important, a representation of Texas history.
What do you think her legacy is on Texas history and on Texas cartography?
I think the legacy there is that she was, I always hate the term ahead of her time, but she was a pioneer in her own right? Because she was one of the only women, the only draftswoman for a very, very long time. I think part of it is this kind of imbuing the maps with history and kind of really making that connection that the maps are part of history, right? They're not just this county record that somebody can look up when there's a property line dispute. The fact that these maps are art, right? They're history, and they tell a lot about Texas in the 20th century. So I think that's part of her legacy is kind of goes back to we were talking about the mapping Texas. I think there's a lot of people, once they see her work, will really understand her importance to Texas cartography, but also to Texas history.
To slightly change gears a little bit, I like to, and also to start winding down, I'd like to acknowledge that we have a mutual love for maps. And this is a question I ask everybody, but I know that my favorite map or my favorite document changes by the day. It just, whichever one I'm looking at becomes my favorite. Mm-hmm. So if in all your studies of Texas history, world history, transatlantic history, can you pick one map or document or artifact as your favorite?
It's like children, right? You don't want to pick your favorite. That's why you have none.
But we all know which one.
Yeah, right. So you probably know this for Texas, I know everyone loves, some of the big, like De Cordova, right? These kind of things. My personal favorite Texas history, my map of Texas is, the 1561 Rochelle, which I have my framed one that you guys gave me when I left. That is one of my favorite maps of Texas. And because it looks nothing like Texas, it seems wrong, but I love it because it shows Texas before Texas, right? It shows what Spain is doing, what Spain is thinking. I love to show it because people don't think of it as a map of Texas. It's tiny. It's like an 8 by 10 sheet of paper size map. Came out of an atlas, and it's beautiful. It's incorrect. There's mountains running, right across Texas. But I love it. I just love it because it's that potential of what's coming. Like looking back from 2020, we know what happens. But I love it because they don't know. This is what they think they know. This is what they think is going to be discovered. They've heard that things are in places, right? It's pre-longitude, latitude being really fixed. So it's really funky shaped. But for some reason, that map has been my favorite from the very first time I saw it. When I came to the GLO, that has been and still is my favorite map of Texas.
As any true map nerd, from one to another, you can't pick just one. Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Cardona, Mylynka, my friend, thank you for coming on to have a Save Texas History conversation. Yeah, we appreciate your time and telling us a little bit more about Ms. Tene, Althea Armstrong, your research, and on behalf of Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office, thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next time for a Save Texas History conversation.
Thank you.
On behalf of Commissioner George P. Bush and the Texas General Land Office, thank you once again for joining us here. We'll be back next time with more This Week in Texas History.